When the winds of independence swept across Africa in the mid-20th century, a surprising decision was made. African leaders chose to maintain the colonial borders that had been drawn by foreign hands. But why? This decision was driven by fear of chaos, pragmatic concerns, and the looming threat of conflict. But what if these borders were redrawn? Could it heal old wounds or plunge the continent into deeper instability? In this video, we'll explore the historical and political forces that shaped Africa's borders, the difficult decision to preserve them, and the profound consequences of this choice. We'll also dive into the risks tied to reshaping these boundaries today, a question that continues to affect the future of the continent. To understand the African borders of today, we first need to understand how they were originally drawn. Before European colonization, Africa's borders were fluid. They weren't defined by lines on a map, but by natural landmarks like rivers, mountains, and deserts. These geographical features often served as boundaries for different societies and kingdoms, such as the Kingdom of Congo, the Oyo Empire, the Zulu Kingdom, and the Ethiopian Empire. Within these borders, the continent's cultural and ethnic diversity flourished, with hundreds of different languages, customs, and governance structures coexisting in dynamic ways. However, the Scramble for Africa in the late 19th century dramatically altered this landscape. Between 1884 and 1914, European powers carved up the continent, disregarding the natural, historical, and cultural divisions that had long existed. The Berlin Conference of 1884, convened by Otto von Bismarck, was the pivotal event in this process. European representatives gathered to formalize the division of Africa, setting rules for colonization without any input from African rulers or communities. At this time, Africa was home to a complex patchwork of kingdoms, chiefdoms, and empires, each with its own understanding of territory. Yet European powers, motivated by the Industrial Revolution's hunger for resources, sought to impose their control over the continent. By the onset of World War I, nearly 90% of Africa had been colonized, with each European power taking control of vast swaths of land, often with little knowledge of the local context or the people living there. As a result, the map that emerged from the Berlin Conference was a haphazard and artificial creation. Borders were drawn with little regard for the ethnic, cultural, or linguistic groups that had existed for centuries. In fact, these colonial borders often split up ethnic communities or merged rival groups into single territories, sowing seeds of future conflict. The consequences of this European-driven map-making have been profound. Take the case of the Somali people, who were divided into 5 different nations by colonial powers. Today, Somalia, Ethiopia, Kenya, Djibouti, and the former French Somaliland all house different portions of the Somali population, creating ongoing tensions and conflicts. Similarly, the Afar people, traditionally living in the Horn of Africa, now find themselves divided between Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Djibouti. Even today, these arbitrary borders fuel ethnic conflicts, territorial disputes, and social instability. The Democratic Republic of Congo, for instance, still suffers from territorial disputes rooted in colonial-era boundary issues. Similarly, the long-standing conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea, which erupted into a brutal war in the late 1990s, can be traced back to colonial-era decisions about where one border ended and another began. This history is a stark reminder of how deeply the legacy of colonialism continues to affect African politics. When African nations gained independence in the 1950s and 1960s, the question arose: should the newly formed states redraw the colonial borders? Leaders like Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana and Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya were among those who considered the implications of such a move. They understood that the colonial borders were artificial and unjust, but they also recognized the dangers involved in redrawing them. In 1963, the Organization of African Unity, or the OAU, met in Addis Ababa to discuss the future of the continent. After much debate, the OAU made the critical decision to retain the colonial borders. The reasoning was clear. Changing the borders could lead to large-scale violence, instability, and the fragmentation of newly independent states. The fear was that attempting to redraw boundaries could spark border wars as different ethnic groups vied for power and as old colonial rivalries flared up. Thus, the OAU enshrined the principle of territorial integrity, declaring in its charter that each member state pledges to respect the borders existing on its achievement of national independence. While the decision was seen as a pragmatic response to the realities of post-colonial Africa, it came with significant drawbacks. By preserving the borders, the OAU froze the status quo, leaving many unresolved tensions simmering under the surface. Although the decision to maintain colonial borders was made to avoid chaos, it did not prevent conflict. On the contrary, the artificial divisions imposed by colonial powers have been a source of numerous ethnic and political conflicts. According to a 2009 study, over 30% of Africa's ethnic groups have been involved in ethnic wars, particularly in two-sided conflicts between government forces and rebel factions. In Nigeria, for example, the division of ethnic groups across national borders has fueled decades of violence. In Sudan and South Sudan, tensions between the Arab-dominated North and the Black African South culminated in decades of civil war, only to result in the separation of the two countries in 2011. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, poorly defined colonial borders have made the country a hotbed of conflict, with various armed groups vying for control over the country's rich natural resources. These examples illustrate how colonial borders, far from ensuring stability, often exacerbated existing tensions, creating a volatile political landscape that continues to haunt Africa. Despite the ongoing challenges posed by colonial borders, there have been moments of diplomatic success. The peaceful secession of South Sudan from Sudan in 2011 stands out as a notable example of how African countries can navigate the complexities of colonial legacies. The process, though fraught with difficulties, ultimately resulted in a new nation born from the desire to resolve long-standing ethnic and political tensions. Similarly, the 2002 resolution of the Bakassi Peninsula dispute between Nigeria and Cameroon demonstrates the potential for peaceful diplomacy. The International Court of Justice played a critical role in settling the territorial dispute, marking a rare example of successful conflict resolution through international law. Such cases highlight the potential for diplomacy and dialogue to address the challenges created by colonial borders. Regional organizations, such as the African Union, are playing an increasingly important role in fostering cooperation and integration, while cross-border initiatives are helping to resolve lingering disputes. By prioritizing diplomacy and negotiation, African countries are slowly moving towards solutions that acknowledge both the colonial past and the present-day realities. The decision to maintain colonial borders was a pragmatic one, born out of a desire to prevent further conflict and preserve the fragile peace that followed independence. However, these borders continue to be a source of tension, conflict, and division. The legacy of colonial partition is deeply entrenched in African politics, and it remains a powerful force shaping the continent's future. Today, there are signs that African nations are finding ways to overcome the challenges posed by these borders. Regional integration initiatives, such as the African Continental Free Trade Area, are helping to bridge divides and promote cooperation between neighboring states. There is also a growing recognition of the need for cross-border collaboration to address shared challenges, such as climate change, migration, and security threats. Ultimately, Reshaping Africa's borders is not just a geographical issue. It is a deeply political and social challenge. The continent's future lies in finding ways to address these challenges without reopening old wounds. By fostering diplomacy, dialogue, and regional cooperation, Africa can chart a path toward unity and stability, turning the page on its colonial past and building a brighter future for its people.